So where are we at? I am taking you through a tour of Cambodia, then Kuwait, then Qatar, then London in the UK, in response to this excerpt from a episode of Kabul Falling, where Fatima testifies thusly.
My body is so exhausted that just 2 days ago I had a panic attack and I couldn't move for 5 hours. This is what war does to people. Take your inner peace away, turn you to kind of a robot, if I can say. Sometimes you have no emotions, no feelings. Sometimes you are a ball of anger. Sometimes you feel like a ghost, that nobody sees you.
So, as related in the last episode, this testimony reminded me of some of the trauma, some of the lack of sleep, the flattening of emotions, never feeling that I can enjoy something. That was the result of my experience working as a happy expat through these countries. Necessarily what I wish to do involves testifying against some powerful figures and companies, even regimes. So that's why it was great timing that J.D. Vance recently said the following.
To believe in democracy is to understand that each of our citizens has wisdom and has a voice. And if we refuse to listen to that voice, even our most successful fights will secure very little. As Pope John Paul II, in my view, one of the most extraordinary champions of democracy on this continent or any other, once said, "Do not be afraid." We shouldn't be afraid of our people, even when they express views that disagree with their leadership.
Good, so that's what I'm going to be doing in this episode, expressing definitely some views that differ from the leadership of companies like Amec Foster Wheeler, which was in October 2017 purchased by Wood PLC, and some of the leaders at that company when I was there from 2013 to 2017. This, needless to say, it is a challenging prospect, giving this testimony. But, you know, if Fatima can do it, someone who had to escape Afghanistan during the fall of the latest US regime there, then, you know, what am I if I can't? And what are we, considering where I come from, with my Australian, British passports and a US green card? What are we if I can't, especially when J.D. Vance has just said what he said? So here we go. As I said in the last episode, I do have a plan. So this is the plan for Kuwait. Again, there's a dictatorial, authoritarian type political situation there. It has to be said and celebrated, actually, though, that Kuwait is a parliamentary democracy of a sort. Certainly the parliament has been dissolved very many times by the real leaders in Kuwait, but they do have elections. So I love that. And it was always a fun time when the elections happened, when we were in Kuwait, and seeing the platforms and some of the more colourful characters, how they tried to win votes. Nevertheless, the reason why I am making observations of dictatorial nature to do with this country is that during the Arab Spring, there was a parliamentarian who spoke out against the king, and who effectively said, you know, that the people have a right to challenge him. However, he then found his parliamentary immunity withdrawn. He was treated harshly by the judicial system. There were thousands who protested, but they were tear gassed. So, you know, this is the kind of thing that doesn't really happen, in my view, and I think many of ours view, in a regular democracy. So, yeah, there's some progress needed there, if I can put it that way. So again, this is a series of reflections about the traumas that I experienced, and to explain why this testimony from Fatima rang true to me and gave me pause, really, and stuck in my mind for a month after I listened to it, resulting in me having to speak out. So we talked about a traffic accident-related trauma that I went through in Cambodia. In a similar there was a similar experience that I had in Kuwait. So I was going home one night from the office at Amec Foster Wheeler, 50 meters from the Bergen oil field run by the Kuwait Oil Company. So there's two main north-south drags in Kuwait between Ahmadi and Kuwait City. One is Highway 30, one is Highway 40. Highway 30 is known for being sort of the modern highway of death. The original highway of death was Highway 80, named so for the incineration, basically, of the entire column of retreating Iraqi troops in the early 1990s. So what happened then was that the Western forces that decided that it wasn't okay for Saddam to take Kuwait brought consequences to these retreating Iraqi forces. And there were horrific images in the news of essentially just, charred bodies from the bombing of these men on Highway 80. So that was the old highway of death. The new highway of death, Highway 30, basically every morning you would see a major vehicle collision on the way to work, and the wreck would still be on the side of the road on the way back, along with fresh ones in the evening. So an example of one of these occurring was one evening when traffic was backed up for some reason, and everybody someone must have been frustrated. They, in their very large SUV, so we're talking Nissan Patrol, Toyota Land Cruiser, Chevy Tahoe size thing, they got over in the left-hand emergency lane and proceeded to floor it, driving 100 plus kilometers an hour in the emergency lane beside the stalled traffic on the actual highway. And then somehow traffic started moving a bit, or a gap opened up in front of me, and it was at this point that this car I saw out of the corner of my eye sped along and rammed straight into another parked large SUV. And it was off the order of sort of within 50 meters ahead of me. So I had a full view. It just happened, and it was essentially an explosion. I'll never forget this, thudding, crunching sound, and just a massive plume of dust and sand, because this is Kuwait and the desert, and there's that sort of thing everywhere, and glass just exploded. And as I sort of, traffic once again obviously slowed down, as I sort of, drove past, I saw this body slumped over the steering wheel in this SUV that had rammed into, another one in front of it. And the airbag, now that I think of it in the retelling of this detail has never sort of occurred to me, but the airbag clearly hadn't deployed. So, chances weren't great for this individual. And so many other incredibly traumatic experiences. So, as you can see in the agenda there, there is an item about domestic workers, there's passport confiscation, there are suicides, workplace safety, major issue, I resigned, there's comments about the stock price, and there's a poem. So let's step through each of these. So domestic workers. There is a significant and well-known issue across the Middle East, or the so-called kafala states, with the mistreatment of domestic workers. And all I can say is that, I was aware of it as a background issue. I was a busy beaver, conscientious geospatial analyst on this project that I was doing, somehow actually proud to be working for one of the largest global engineering firms at the time, on a high-profile project for the Kuwait Oil Company. So these were the dynamics of what I'm trying to say about how experience and life comes at you in a place like that. Nevertheless, it finally punched through my consciousness when an image did the rounds of an abused Filipino domestic worker in Saudi Arabia, who it was just a horrific image of her back showing burns all over it from scalding hot water having been thrown over her by the wife of the house. Now, it has to be said that I saw this on social media. There was, however, news reporting about it. So there was some verification of it there. And also there was a pattern of hundreds of these abuse cases over years appearing in the media. And I just felt that there was this massive contrast immediately in my mind with the success that I had, as earning six figures tax-free with all the privileges that come with being a Western expat worker in Kuwait, and the lot of those without the privileges that I enjoyed. So it caused a crisis in me, and what I simultaneously observed was that nobody really with power was speaking up about this issue, and I assumed it was because of fear. I didn't assume that it was because they agreed with the mistreatment of these people. But there's, who knows? Given the context in the previous episode of this dehumanization and infrahumanization phenomenon, at least because the people doing the abusing and those who were being abused were possibly classified as coming from an outgroup, for those who had the power, so especially the Kuwaitis or locals and Westerners, perhaps because they couldn't identify with those being abused as much as if it had happened to someone from an in-group, their power was not likely to be activated. Yet, possibly because of my more multicultural upbringing, it was. Maybe that's what was going on. I don't want to paint myself in an unnecessarily positive light, but worth some comment. I guess I just wanted to comment on, why I chose to say something. Also, if I'm honest, because I come from, at best, a working class background, I identify with those who are from a less privileged place in life. And perhaps it could be said, I am sympathetic to everyone trying to to better their lives, and to injustice where those from the class, I hate to use that word, but it seems the most efficient way to describe things, where they are from appear to me to be from the same class that I am from. I'm using that term aware of its enormous centuries-long political and cultural baggage. I am in no way, this is the Geospatial Index podcast about finance, right, and investing in a shameless effort to use the markets to literally double our lifetime incomes, all right? So I like to consider myself one of the biggest fans of small-time capitalism. And in that context, I use the word class. So because of feeling that I somehow identified with the people being abused, and not seeing those from other classes speaking up, the higher classes speaking up, I decided that I would, and that I would enjoy the difficulty that those who weren't speaking up from higher classes may have had. seeing that I was speaking up and maybe jeopardizing the power structure that they enjoyed. So at the time I was running the Kuwait map up, having started a similar thing in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh, and seeing that it was a fantastic community building, networking approach and a way to enjoy the broader applications of geospatial and just celebrate everybody's successes every month. So that was going really well. But then I decided, when I saw this horrific image of this abused domestic worker, I'd change it to the Kuwait human rights mapping meetup. And, you know, I was also involved in some writing clubs, and through that there was someone who had gone to school with and grown up with a Kuwaiti princess. Her name was Bibi Nasser, but she was from the Al Sabah family, one of the ruling families. It sort of bounces between two families in Kuwait. At the time, the emir, or the king, happened to be from the Al Sabah family. So this fellow writing club member put me in touch with Bibi because she had started the Kuwait Social Work Society, where she was using her power as a member of the royal family to advocate on behalf of and bring consequences to those who abuse domestic workers. This is wonderful, right? So it shows, and I need to give due recognition to those from inside Kuwait, Kuwaiti nationals, who feel terrible about the situation and are sacrificing their time and energy and resources to bring justice. So it was amazing. I remember the first phone call I had with her. I was extraordinarily nervous, but you know, it's a testament to her dedication that she actually came along to one of the meetups that I arranged about applying geospatial to this problem of domestic worker abuse. And there's a somewhat extraordinary story to tell. So I came to understand, right? And this story is one of the value of verifying things. So I came to understand from a contact that in a hospital ward next door to the ward where the mother of my contact was staying, that they had overheard, news of a woman in this ward next door, that she was a domestic worker who had been abused, and that she had been dropped off at the door of the hospital and basically abandoned there for the hospital to look after her. And this sort of fit into what stories in the news and other evidence via social media of this broader domestic worker abuse problem. And so I was like, okay, if we're going to do something, we might as well see if we can, as a group, get some people who speak the Indian language that this woman speaks, and see if we can go along and hear what she has to say and perhaps offer her some support. And it was that event that Bibi decided to participate in, and she came along herself and stood in the hospital ward with this effectively translator and heard the full story of what had happened. And I, to this day, am shocked and almost am in disbelief that actually of the true story as was told to us by Bibi after she listened and asked some questions. So, in fact, apparently what happened was that there was multiple domestic workers in this Kuwaiti household where this woman was working. And another woman wanted to bring her daughter from her country to work in this household. And she had tried to oust this woman that we were visiting through a campaign of what was said to be subterfuge and abuse and sabotage, to bring mistrust in the family upon this woman, and ultimately, yeah, to get her removed so that this other woman's daughter could come in and replace her. So this already sounds a bit strange, but if it's true, it attests to the desperate circumstances that a lot of these domestic workers come from in so-called corrupt countries around the world, where employment prospects, unemployment rates are high. Even if you do get a job, salaries are incredibly low, and in general, working and living conditions are horrific, which drives people to do what, to those such as myself from more fortunate countries, would view to be, unexplainable things, such as this. Anyway, so apparently this is what occurred. This is of the order of 10 years ago, so I can't remember exactly all of the details. Anyway, so already you're sort of wondering, okay, well, at least this is a sign that it is good to verify things. So what? As I said, it was a long time ago, so all of the details I am not going to recall. I'm sorry, and I really do wish that I had engaged in this testimony, by the way, a lot earlier. But here we are. So what was next? So what arose was some sort of a conflict in the household where this woman apparently was taken by the household to the police, and she was left there apparently. And while she was waiting in the office at the police department, apparently she had an episode of incontinence, and the police knew then that she was unwell, obviously, and then took her to the hospital. What the hospital then discovered was that actually she had cancer, and then they proceeded to treat her and stabilize her and look after her. So what emerges is, at least in terms of the police and the health department in Kuwait, doing what should be done to look after this person. Which is not at all to endorse what appeared to be happening in the household. And so then that was basically where it was left for us. It appeared that, all said and done, at least where she was and what was happening in the hospital was legitimate, and that, the government was doing, what it could do to address what it could in this otherwise, overall unhappy situation. And that was a really difficult, confronting, but important encounter with this princess that this group, that I'd assembled had. And I'll never forget, I think it was in a Caribou coffee shop in Kuwait City afterwards, vaguely nearby this hospital. But it was also, this princess also being there was an opportunity for the rest of the group and all of us really to voice some concerns about the general situation on the treatment of, people from especially more vulnerable countries in Kuwait, and the overall plight that this woman was very well aware of, and was bad enough for her to start the Kuwait Social Work Society. So, it was in some ways fraught, and, I felt a bit embarrassed that, on the one hand, I'd been led to believe that there was a genuine abuse situation with this woman by someone else. But then when we ourselves went to verify it with this princess, no less, we found out that the situation was incredibly more nuanced, and it was sort of abuse on top of abuse, or at least that there was, as far as the telling by this princess based on what the interpreter told us, that in fact the domestic workers themselves were up to some shenanigans between them. Yeah. So this is not to cast doubt on this broad issue, but it is apparently an honest account of the general chicanery that can go down, and to which people are propelled when they are when they're motivated by desperate circumstances. So we got a phone number from a caseworker at the Indian embassy. We knew this woman's name, and I followed up a couple of times about what happened to her. And once she was stabilized in the hospital, she was sent to the deportation prison and was eventually, after about a month, sent back to India. So, it's brutal and confronting. And, I mean, as a cancer patient, one hopes that, she was adequately in a decent enough state to be discharged from a hospital to a deportation prison and, dumped back in India. So anyway, just such a contrast that was her plight, and my experience was, given a SUV company car, tax-free 6-figure salary, air-conditioned office, 35 days annual leave a year, basically cashed up young, early 30s white man, world is my oyster, going on holidays all around the world, living like a king, living in a coastal villa, 200 meters from the beach, going kayaking every night, enjoying the water, going sailing at, Kuwait Offshore Sailing Club multiple times a week. And then this is how the majority of people in Kuwait live. Well, an example of how bad it can get for them. I say that because there's about 4.5 million in Kuwait, maybe 1.5 million Kuwaitis. The rest are expats, and the very vast majority are from, the world's poorest, most corrupt countries: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Philippines, Indonesia. There were some Syrians, hundreds of thousands of Egyptians, and there was daylight between us and them in terms of living conditions and opportunities. What else to say? Some more detail about applications of geospatial and a broader sort of vicarious trauma through doing that in terms of the domestic worker issue. So there was an Ushahidi crowd map with 450 odd verified news reports of domestic worker abuse across the kafala states. I used this term before. What does that mean? Well, the kafala sponsorship system was cooked up during British rule on the Arabian Peninsula, and it's it's a sort of legal system for bringing people from overseas into one's house to work as a construction worker, labourer, domestic worker, etc. And the Bahrain Labour Minister, 10 years ago is on record as saying that this is a slavery system, or it produces slave-like conditions. So why am I mentioning this crowd map? Well, it was started by an Ethiopian living in Washington, D.C., when another Ethiopian, a domestic worker, threw herself to her death off a balcony in Beirut in Lebanon because she was being abused. And he did what he could to respond and bring light to this issue. So he fired up the Ushahidi Crowd Mapper platform, which is now defunct, and put on a map the location of every single news report across the kafala states. So, essentially all countries on the Arabian Peninsula. I'm not sure if kafala system exists in Lebanon. Anyway, it was triggered by, the issue mainly existed in terms of his mapping across the kafala states on the Arabian Peninsula. And so I came across this map. I ended up inviting him to appear via video call at one of our Kuwait human rights map up events. So he, over a few years, accumulated these 400 plus reports. I then converted those into some static maps and did some analysis and presented those at some of these mapping events. So yeah, this was one aspect, or another aspect along with that traffic accident, of the traumas that I went through, and my efforts to be, I don't want to use the word advocate because this seems wishy-washy, to bring consequences or to bring justice for those that I identified with. And genuinely, I did want there to be consequences for those who sought to exploit the underclasses. That's really what's going on here. So what was another category? We had this plan. We have covered the Highway 30 crash, which is one of many. We've covered domestic workers, passport confiscation. So passport confiscation is a common problem in, again, the Kafala states. It is almost standard procedure that if you are from one of these more impoverished, less fortunate countries, that as soon as you arrive in Kuwait, they will take away your passport and you will therefore not have freedom of movement. This contravenes things like the Modern Slavery Act of 2015 in the UK, where people must not undergo forced labor. And it is a form of forced labor to confiscate someone's passport, because you then you're not letting them leave at will. So to my horror, when in 2017, after 4.5 years working for Amec Foster Wheeler at the Altamir Annex, 50 meters, a stone's throw from the Bergen oil field, in Al Ahmadi in Kuwait, I came to understand that the security staff employed by G4S, a British publicly traded security company, didn't have their passports. I also came to understand that the catering staff in that office had their passports confiscated. A man, referred to by others as a T-boy, told me that he'd been working for 10 years, unable to leave, because his passport had been confiscated. Now, this is a man who's walking around serving tea to a largely Western expat workforce who were all on, 100,000 plus salaries minimum, paying no tax, enjoying the sorts of perks that I described before. And here was he walking up and down the corridor amongst all the desks, providing coffee, trying to make sure that he got it there on the desk as soon as they, prepared to suit their preferences on the desk when they started work in the morning. Okay? He was running up and down doing that under conditions of forced labor, whilst we were all enjoying our Western white privilege. And several of the staff, British management staff, referred to him and others as boys. There was also an Indian office manager who referred to them as T-boys. Furthermore, on the topic of infantilizing staff from the East, there was a project manager on my project who referred to the Indian scientists working at site as kids. So what's this reminding us of? I'll share my screen again. So I, made a blog post about kicking off, this mini-series. And I've got the screenshot here from Nick Haslam's publication about, dehumanization and integrative review. And on the human uniqueness to animalistic dehumanization continuum, One of them is maturity to childlikeness, and that those that we dehumanize, we do that by incorrectly considering them as being childlike. So what is this direct sort of verification of this framework? What else is it but that these men, several of whom had children, were the Western British, mainly, male managers themselves did not have children, by the way, themselves. So they were referring to these married fathers as boys or kids. This is basically a direct verification of this aspect of Haslam's framework for dehumanization here. Yeah. So, passport confiscation, yes, was a thing. Now, it was also a thing for me. In fact, it was standard procedure for any new employee brought in from overseas of Amec Foster Wheeler. Amec at the time when I joined them in 2013. Later became Amec Foster Wheeler when they bought Foster Wheeler, and then 3 months after I left, they became Wood when they were purchased October 2017. So even for me, my passport was confiscated for 3 months when I joined. It was a standard procedure by HR, and the reason they gave was that they needed to use the passport to apply for a residence permit, for a national ID card, and for all sorts of other administrative things to get you set up, basically, as a worker in Kuwait. Now, that's fair enough. Certainly, there are a lot of administrative things that had to be done to go through the bureaucracy to give you even your driver's license and all of those things. So from that side of things, I can understand, and it could be inefficient to, wait a day, for someone to bring their passport. Maybe they'll forget, and that could delay the process of getting, your national ID, for example, issued. But then let's think of it from another perspective. It is usually a huge shock coming to Kuwait from any country. It is an incredibly racist place. The simplest evidence I can give for that is that the labor law in Kuwait says that those from the West should be paid more than those from the East, even for the same job. So from the government down, Kuwait is racist. And the treatment of those from the East is horrific. It is a massive shock to the system, but also it is a shock to the system for those from the West who are used to, ironically, as it was said in that quote from Free the Map by Henk, when Westerners are used to, a liberal democratic approach where everybody, at least within their countries, experiences equality. And by the definition of the law, there is not equality in Kuwait. And so for that reason, it is also an incredibly shocking experience coming from the West to Kuwait. So if you think about a company trying to stop people acting on the shock that they feel and turning around and leaving, it would be convenient and sensible for them to temporarily, for 3 months, during that initial shock period, confiscate new employees' passports. Now, an example of, one must wonder, an outcome of the shock of the transition from India to Kuwait. There was a young engineer who hung himself in his apartment within 2 months of joining Amec Foster Wheeler. His body was discovered several days after he killed himself. That's because even when the working week starts on a Sunday, even when he didn't turn up on Sunday, the alarm wasn't raised and people didn't go to his apartment or follow up. I don't know how many days exactly it was, but it was far too many, several more than, justice says should happen, should pass. And yeah, this was one of many utterly shocking announcements that the leadership of Amec Foster Wheeler in that Altamir Annex office in Al Ahmadi made to the staff about suicides and unnecessary deaths amongst the staff of that office. And knowing that this man would probably have been the subject of racist treatment, would probably have found that it was an incredibly shocking circumstance to him and a grave contrast to how he was usually treated in India, especially given that he was, a man deserving of the respect that is afforded an engineer, knowing that this man, going by the usual experience of people from India and Kuwait, may have been having a reaction to this treatment, and knowing Amec Foster Wheeler's HR department's policy of confiscating passports for around 3 months for new employees, knowing that, at this being subject to that kind of treatment, this man may have wanted to use his passport to go back to India and yet could not, I find myself haunted by the existence of this policy and that it accompanied the death by suicide of this engineer, along with the further indignity that his dead body was left hanging for days because the manager that, was supposed to look after his goddamn welfare, especially during the difficult transition period when you're a new employee, didn't have in place a practice to check on him and find out why he didn't turn up to work at the beginning of the fucking week. So we've skipped forward a bit to, as terrible as it sounds, the suicide item on the agenda. But that was after passport confiscation. So we've covered off passport confiscation. We've gone straight into suicides. Again, this is just terrific to find myself talking about this. There was another suicide. This was in 2017. This was the one. There was a collection of horrific events that pushed me over the edge. One might say it radicalized me. So I came to understand that there was a construction worker who hung himself on a pipe rack at a gathering center in the North Kuwait asset. The Kuwait Oil Company has 4 assets: North Kuwait, near the Iraqi border, South and East Kuwait, which are together the Bergen oil field, south of Kuwait City. It's a very large, it takes about half an hour to drive from one end to the other. And then there is the West Kuwait asset down on the Saudi border. So the North Kuwait asset was sort of the last to begin to be exploited because the gas there is sour, and the quality of hydrocarbons there is lower. But given that they were starting to have to use alternative extraction methods like steam injection or CO2 injection to continue the exploitation of the Bergen oil field, they were starting to develop the North Kuwait asset. A part of the crude oil extraction process is to use a gathering center, which basically brings the raw oil that you get out of the ground to this factory that splits it off into, sort of sludge, effluent water, and oil, which then goes to one of the refineries on the coast. They were building, Amec Foster Wheeler was responsible for the new refinery project south, in the south of Kuwait, on the coast. There was an existing refinery already. Anyway, so one of these, there was a couple of gathering centers. I think there was GC30 and GC31 that were being constructed. And this man hung himself on a pipe rack, because what these factories are is just, effectively hundreds of meters, if not kilometers of pipe just bent in all directions. And there are racks of these pipes. And he went on the weekend, somehow got through security and got onto the site outside of working hours. And in what can only be interpreted, or what it has to say one is invited to interpret this action as a protest about something at work. He hung himself directly on the facility that he was involved in constructing. And staff found the body hanging on Sunday. So what made this already horrific circumstance cross the line for me into an atrocity was that this death was classified as not being a workplace incident. And what does that mean? Well, this means that all of the procedures that law compels companies to do when there is a workplace incident, such as, very thorough reviews, possibly resulting in, legal consequences, firing of management, even changes to workplace safety regulations, security. All of those reviews didn't need to occur because it was not classified as a workplace incident. Again, this man used his site pass to get through security to hang himself at the workplace. This man was Indian. He was of brown skin, from a vulnerable population. It is incontestable that the power that he had was several orders of magnitude less than me and others from the West who were responsible for managing that construction project. And yet, what these motherfuckers chose to do was to classify it as not being a workplace incident. And all of this was said, apparently without much shame, in a town hall meeting by the operations director in front of us 300 odd staff at the Altamir Annex in Al Ahmadi Governorate, 50 meters from the Bergen oil field fence. What else happened? So I recall how one day we were celebrated as being the best project management consultancy amongst the 4 that the Kuwait Oil Company employed. What we existed to do was to minimize the risk for the Kuwait Oil Company in execution of its projects by the myriad international contractors from around the world. So the more expensive Western firms, the Kuwait Oil Company didn't want to pay us to execute on those projects. They only wanted to spend the amount of money necessary to employ us to manage all of those construction contractors. And yeah, there were 4 of them. The others were, the likes of Worley Parsons, for example, Technique, those sort of larger multinational engineering consultancies. So apparently we were the best at what we were doing. And I will never forget the day when Nick Shorten, a high-powered manager within Amec Foster Wheeler based in Dubai, came up along with another individual who spoke English with a Portuguese or Spanish accent. And they both stood at the front of Block B, where all the managers sat in that Altamir annex. They stood in front of us. And in the same breath, Nick announced that we'd been told we were the best PMC, project management consultancy, by the client, the Kuwait Oil Company. In the same breath, he said, "I very much regret to say, yesterday 2 men were crushed to death in a trench when a concrete beam fell on them." It strikes me as being a catastrophically crass and insensitive thing to do, to celebrate anything whatsoever, let alone that we were supposedly the best PMC. In the same breath as having to confess to the staff, all of us in a town hall, that the day before, 2 men had lost their lives, crushed to death by a concrete beam in a trench. It should never have crossed this individual's mind to celebrate anything whatsoever that day, telling us that we had lost 2 men. I again am reminded of the habit that British staff had, British management personnel particularly, of referring to those from outside their country, especially brown men from the East, as boys or kids. I am reminded of this form of dehumanization that they committed in the choice Nick Shorten made to tell us he was there to celebrate our client telling us we were the best, in the same breath as saying, "Oh, I regret to inform you, 2 brown men lost their lives yesterday." That should never have happened. He should have cancelled that celebration. He should have stood in front of us expressing his immense shame that the mismanagement of safety on our projects had led to those deaths. That should have been the end of it. He should have gone home. Well, that is to say, he should have shut the hell up and sent us back to our desks, and he should have stayed in Kuwait for however long it took to improve safety management such that those kind of deaths never, ever happened again. And it should have started with an audit of dehumanization attitudes within the fucking workforce. No such commitment was made to us. We were left to deal with the trauma of processing that juxtaposition that he put in front of us, ourselves, in our own ways, at home, at night, alone or with our families. I spoke about a cluster of what I'm going to say are atrocities that tip me over the edge, that is causing me to say what I'm saying to you today. So let's talk about another one. It's going to sound a bit minor, but I hope to characterize it to you in a way that you understand why I was driven to do this. It's time for me to go and pick up my daughter from the nursery. So I'm going to pause things now. I think you might be able to see on my face and hear in my voice that I am on the edge now too. So we're going to have another episode. Until next time.